bloodied and demoralized. That is how the description is being placed upon the Ukrainian soldiers who continue to fight and struggle all across the line of contact, everywhere from Kursk up in the north to the Kharkiv area in the northeast, and then all along the eastern front from Kupiansk down to Zaporizhia, and then even down to the border with Ukraine, with Russia down there. And man, when you look more and more at the people involved and more at the situation, when you look at the battle map, when you look at the diplomatic map, when you look at the political map, everywhere you want to look, things are going much more just detrimental for the Ukrainian side. We've been talking about this many times, and we have postulated after the election of Donald Trump that we had wondered, how is it going to be for the troops that are fighting the war? You may recall, we postulated that many times. I said, for my own personal combat experience, I couldn't imagine what it would be like to see these developments here on something at the diplomatic and political and other countries front that would then have a direct correlation to what you're fighting for, and to show that there's really no reason to continue fighting because there's no path to victory. There's not even a prospect of victory when you hear that your biggest patron, the only reason you're able to survive at all, is now with the incoming leaders saying, we're going to have a negotiated settlement. We're going to bring this to an end as soon as I come into power. Or as he claimed many times, Trump did, before I even get into office on January 20. So one wonders, what would the troops be fighting for? Well, now we're starting to see it manifest physically on the battlefield, and it's now being reported in a lot of Western media. It's been reported in many others for a while, but the Western media kind of tended to go away from it. But now reality is starting to seep in so much that even the pro-Ukrainian Western media can no longer ignore the evidence coming out. And we see now then, especially in the northern part there, that one of the focuses on was around the Ukraine soldiers in Kursk, because as we've been showing you this map really since September, October, it is just methodically being squeezed down. Sometimes it goes slow, sometimes it has bigger impact, but the direction is all one way. It's all in shrinking the holdings. And just on this, just at face value, it's really hard. And I've been reading this on lots of Ukrainian Telegram channels of late, giving voice to what we talked about from the very beginning, back in August. What is the purpose of this? What is the intention? What are men fighting and dying for? By some accounts, up to 40,000 Ukrainian men have been killed in this salient. And for what? That's one of the bigger issues. When you're talking about morale and motivation for soldiers, it's composed of a number of things, but really near the top of that list has got to be what you're fighting for. And what are the men in the Ukraine salient fighting for? Is it for some media victory to get a good social media bump, something to that effect, to make the Western people think that, hey, we're doing good things, so keep supporting us? I mean, that's kind of an ethereal, theoretical thing. Maybe it is. It does appear that was what the Kiev seemed to think about, Zelensky, when he continues to give orders that the troops stay there no matter what, that they not withdraw. We postulated many times, months into this, that the thing that made the most military sense would be to say, you could put whatever face on it you wanted. Okay, we caused Russia to have to do something. They had to move 50,000 troops here, which by many accounts is exactly what did happen. Where they came from is secondary. They didn't come from the front, apparently, but they came from somewhere because they weren't there before. So you could have said, okay, we achieved that success. We repositioned, large numbers of Russian troops, but now then we're going to withdraw back to our lines, back to our defensible lines, and save all those soldiers. They didn't do it. And now then the claim out of Kiev is that we're keeping them up there so that when Trump gets in, and we have to keep it by all means before Trump comes in, so that we can use them as negotiating leverage to get something elsewhere from Russia. But listen, I mean, just looking at it at face value, that is a ridiculous concept. There is no chance in God's earth that Putin is going to trade away Russian territory that he can take just by methodically, like a boa constrictor, continuing to squeeze until everybody's dead. He doesn't have to negotiate anything. Time is no problem for Russia. And as we're going to see later in this episode, it's even more of an issue than you may think on Russia's side for some very, very tangible reasons. But then let's look within the Ukraine side itself. When you look at some of the Telegram channels and some of the comments coming from troops that have been inside the Kursk salient, you see them complaining about their leaders, that they don't have a plan, that they don't have an objective, that not even a tactical objective, other than fight here, move here, scurry there, and then wait for some other reinforcements to come in here. They said that the leaders in one sector of the front don't know what's going on in their adjacent sector. So they don't know how they're fighting together, or are they even conflicting with one another? They just don't know. And all of those things just deteriorate, if not outright destroy, your will to fight. Because you have to imagine, why am I going to risk my physical life in something I don't even know what we're trying to do? And you don't have to be an international realist expert like John Mearsheimer we have on our show a lot to be able to look around and say, what in the hell are we doing? This is Russian territory, and they have as many troops as they want. And for months now, we've been shrinking down. There's no value to our country for holding this. We can't hold it. So why am I and my buddy on my left and right, why are we sacrificing our lives for literally nothing at all? And you can see where that's going to have a negative impact. And I would imagine, especially with things the way they are in the pictures that are being painted here of late, that we're probably going to see a more rapid deterioration of that, and in a quickening pace of the decline of the remaining territory that's held by the Ukrainian side. Now, this has had no impact whatsoever on the current U.S. administration, because now then they're saying, listen, we're continuing to do everything we can to get all the weapons and ammunition out the door as soon as possible. And there was an announcement yesterday where the Biden administration said, hey, we're going to give another 1.5, I think it was 1.5 or 1.2 billion dollars to Ukraine. All of this in basically the last 3 weeks of their administration. It's unclear why. It's unclear what the intent is. The stated thing, the only thing that's really stated by administration officials, it's to, quote, give a better negotiating position to the Ukrainian side, end quote. But there's no reality to that. That's an aspiration only, because there's everything you want to look at shows that Putin doesn't affect Putin's calculus. And when you say we're gonna flood the area with another $1 billion now, when all of the I think it's 300 billion, according to Viktor Orban, that both the U.S. and Europe have contributed up to this date. Imagine that. 300 billion euros, which I think is probably around 320, 340 billion dollars, depending on what the exchange rate is on any given day, has not done anything to even slow down the losses on the line of contact. What does anybody think one more $1 billion is going to do at the end, when it's the men, not machines, not the money? That's what this administration, this is one of the most anguishing and aggravating things that I've experienced during this whole coverage of the war we've been doing since our channel existed, is that the senior most leaders, the guys who are supposed to be the smartest men in the room, can't seem to grasp elemental fundamentals. They can't ever seem to learn. They can't see, all right, we tried this, it didn't work. We tried it again, it failed even more spectacularly. Okay, how about a third time? Let's try it a fourth time and a fifth time, even though for very practical reasons it can be absolutely pointed out it's going to fail. And for A, B, and C reasons, it's like, say, listen, I know 1 + 1 ordinarily equals 2, but we really need it to equal 17. So let's put one of these and one of those, and let's see if we can get 17 this time. Maybe it'll work. That's in my view very close to just how bad what we're doing is. And this, 1 point whatever billion dollars and the stated objective is the most recent graphic evidence of it. So there is a total disconnect among the senior leaders of the United States. And of course, this extends to multiple leaders in Europe, though clearly not all of them. And so then you look at what impact this has. That's again, kind of at the diplomatic and political level. Now let's look a little bit at the granular level on the ground. What is this doing? And here's some of the recent reporting. Washington Post had a piece out a couple of days ago that's talking about how a lot of the troops are just getting flat worn out. And as it got closer to Christmas, a lot of the soldiers, they were wondering if Trump is going to end the war, and they just fed into that whole thing I was talking about a minute ago, where they're like, what are we even fighting for? And then there was a couple of specific things from this article I wanted to point out. This one here, it says, but most Ukrainian military personnel acknowledge that soldier shortages are now just as critical as weapons deficits. Some specialized jobs in the 33rd brigade, such as a driver for armored personnel carriers, were down to just one in a battalion. Do we even have infantry? Said a 37-year-old Dennis, a drone operator. It's down to a couple of guys, and they're over 50 years old. What are they going to do? And goodness gracious, I mean, that there's so much wrapped up into those few lines there. This tells you that whatever, last 1 point whatever billion dollars here is actually the tag end of the 61 billion that was allocated most famously into lots of fanfare by the administration in I believe it was May of this year. This is what was going to help turn the tide. And as we've shown you with a number of graphs and charts, it not only did not turn the tide, oddly enough, after that was designated and went into effect and started being sent to Ukraine, the losses increased. It not only didn't turn the tide, for a number of reasons that all go together, the tide actually kept going and got stronger on the Russian side. Now, any rational person would go, holy crap. Okay, well, this is not working. Let's do something different. But you see, there is none of that. And so it's not merely that there aren't enough men. There's also not enough machines and enough ammunition. So in that one thing there, we saw we don't have enough troops. We also don't have enough ammunition and weapons and everything else. And this specific package here, according to the Washington Post, that was just announced yesterday, it includes artillery shells, of 155 millimeter varieties, Stinger missiles, air defense systems, Hawk systems, interceptor missiles, etc. Those are, by the way, very old technology and of modest success. And you see that there's not much that we actually have to give when we're given this old stuff. I think some of it goes back to the Vietnam era in the Hawk missile systems, for example. And you see that Zelensky has been begging for months and months, specifically for 19 Patriot air defense systems, the most modern stuff that there is out there, and none of it has been ponied up. Nobody's given any of it. And there's very practical reasons for that. But you see, instead of doing something that actually would help, because Patriot systems are far from perfect, as Ted Postel from MIT has shown on our show many times. It does still have capabilities against some classes of weapons, and drones and slow-moving cruise missiles. They can be very effective at that. But we haven't given it to them, not because we're mean, but because we don't have it. We don't have it to give, and to take that out of Hyde would be to diminish the national security capacity of the United States, of our Western allies, and nobody is willing to do it. So he's gotten this many of the requested that he's asked for. And instead, we give him other stuff that really isn't going to make any difference. And it's having a negative impact on the troops. And now I want to go to the second part of that. Another part of that article, he says, listen, no one feels like the end is near, meaning a positive end. The morale keeps getting and sinking lower and lower and getting worse and worse. And listen, there's one thing to read that on a map, and you can see that one picture there, and you can kind of imagine a little bit. But I'm going to show you a little bit more granular level. I oftentimes, and let me do it again here, show you the map of what's going on the ground. So this is the Karakhova area. Near the Pokrovsk battle. And, we talk about it, all these red areas there are where Russia's making advances. This is literally every single day. But like this one down here in the Karakhova area, we may show you this that say, okay, you see all of these streets here, and this area around the Karakhova power station right here is one of the most recent things that Russia is now occupying overnight. So it's not much farther because most of the livable area has already been taken. So this whole area is about to be taken by the Russians, and that's going to require the Ukraine side to move further back. Okay, so that's what it looks like on the map. Now let's go a little bit and look at what that means to the people. So what you're going to see in these next two clips that Gary found, by the way, appreciate that, Gary. This is brilliant stuff that really shows on a human level why we make the statements and the observations that we do. This first one here is a soldier who is talking about one of the things that we've mentioned many times here of late, that there have been at minimum at least 100,000 desertions on the battlefield. Now, when oftentimes we hear that, we think, well, that's cowardly. That's terrible to do. What's wrong with those people that do that? They should be brave and fight for their country. Here's what it looks like on the ground.
Розбили. Ми відходили, відійшли. І багато з пацанів вже ніхто не хотів на передок вертатися. І так, ну якось так. А комбат почав збирати ще, там хто лишився, щоб ще раз відправити. Ну, багато не хотіло йти, і то стало так, як підштовхом. Що жити хотіли всі тоді. Молоді хлопці, не дуже обстріляні були такі, ну всі села, всі такі трудяги.
Okay, that is, let's unpack a little bit of what he's talking about there. Now, first, just on the surface of it, you can see he's basically shell-shocked. You can see that he's almost just monotone, just droning out his words, that there's this 1,000-mile stare in his face. And you can imagine before the war, he was probably a vivacious, fun-loving guy, family man possibly. I mean, you can see that there is something really changed. Even if you don't know anything about this guy or never seen him before, you can tell something is desperately wrong here. So that tells you a lot about what he has physically seen and experienced. Secondly, he's talking in that clip there about the fact that they were untrained. Now, how many times have you seen the official statements from General Kursk et al., Zelensky, and all these other leaders in Ukraine, and many even in the U.S. Department of Defense, who claim these guys are well trained. We bring them up. We give them this amount of training, NATO training. Sometimes they're trained in NATO countries and they go back. And yet, report after report, and now out of the mouth of a Ukrainian fighter himself, re-emphasizes a consistent pattern that they aren't trained, that they're literally minimally trained. Here's their weapon. There's a target. Pull off some rounds. All right, you're good to go. Move on to the front. We'll train you at the front, is how they end up saying. Well, what that means is we'll throw you into the meat grinder and see if you survive. But you see in that word there, and that's another potential indicator. This is one person that's talking, so you can't make calculations across the entirety of the somewhere around 300,000 Ukraine troops on the front line. You can't make generalizations based on one, but you can say there's some reason to think that he's not the only one that's saying, okay, it came down to when we're going to withdraw, we chose life. Because again, this gets right back to what I mentioned a minute ago about why are anybody, soldiers from any country, going to sacrifice their lives for something that cannot be won. And now then you see that's for sure that the end is already being negotiated, that your patron is already talking to the leader of your opponent country, the Russians, about what kind of deals are we going to do. So there's no more, you're not fighting for your country anymore. You're not fighting to take anything back. You're just fighting because that's the orders you were given today, and the end is decreed. Past tense, it's decreed. So this is continuing to go on further, and you can certainly imagine that is going to become more prevalent. If the number of 100,000 of desertions is actually true, and it could be more, then that should be a huge red banner to everybody in the West, and definitely everybody in Kiev, that the possibility I've also talked about in the last 6 or 9 months is that the risk of the Ukrainian fabric of its army finally tearing, not fraying, but tearing and coming apart, in which the integrity of the armed forces itself could collapse. This is one of the markers that shows they're moving in that direction. This next video clip here is a different snapshot, also showing the terrible conditions under which these guys live.
На войне всегда есть нехватка времени, нехватка еды, нехватка воды, нехватка средств, нехватка человеческого ресурса. Ну, на войне не может быть все гладко. А кто-то же думает, как в кино. Все классно будет, я буду стрелять, бегать. А там по-другому. То есть сидишь в окопе, да, неделями, и, бывают такие по колено в болоте, да, холодно, голодно, потому что не так просто туда еду еще занести. Так что, как уменьшить количество? Я даже не знаю как. Ну, то есть я же говорю, только надо закончить войну, да, чтобы война закончилась, тогда количество станет меньше.
Well, I mean, you got to hand it to him on the last part there. How do you end the desertions and the absent without leaves and AWOLs and all that kind of stuff? Maybe in the war. Then there'll be no reason to AWOL. There'll be nothing to leave from. But the first part of the stuff you said there is important for more than the obvious reason. The morale, this I can tell you from personal firsthand experience. If I know in my combat experience that I have the full support and backing of our superiors, if food is there on time, if I see medical support is there, if it's needed, their evacuation support is available, and reinforcements and resupplies come in and ammunition. If I see that they're taking care of all those things, I can tell you from my own experience, I will not stop until I'm dead or physically incapacitated. I will keep going because if I'm sent there, I believe that I'm fighting for my country and my defense, etc. But if now all of a sudden there aren't the guys that are coming up aren't trained, they're poor quality. If they show up at all, and we don't have very many of them, the food is almost non-existent, or just terrible. If it comes, and you see many times it doesn't, and you see that, unlike the vision of like it's like a movie, and and all these videos that you may see sometime of like sharp engagements and tanks coming here and drones falling down there, etc. He said that rarely happens. Usually you're just stuck in a trench on the Ukrainian side. Usually you're just stuck in a trench, and especially right now, it is bitterly cold. The conditions are just heinous. I mean, you've heard the relation to the World War I trenches, and they are absolutely accurate. When you look at the conditions that the men had in World War I and what these guys still in the third year of war have right now, there are a great many similarities. And we've even had an American who volunteered on our channel, Matt Van Dyke, on our show earlier this year, who came on and told us that exactly what he said there validates totally what he said. He said we could barely even get out of the trench during the time that he was up there. He said because the drone warfare or artillery or missile strikes, he said you dare not even get out because something, even to go to the bathroom, he said, you're afraid even to get out for that. You could be in there for weeks at a time and then wondering if there's actually going to be enemy coming in. And then sometimes that's exactly what happens. They enter your trenches. That's how a lot of these are eventually solved, aside from just the firepower coming in there. And if all you have to face is these kinds of things here, so no support, no troop support, inadequate food, not enough ammunition, not enough men to come in there, and you don't have any idea what you're even fighting for, and the conditions are that miserable where you're freezing all the time, and all you do is go from one defensive trench backwards to the next. Where's your morale? Where's your focus on that? Now, by itself, those are all huge red flags that almost every time there is a military that breaks and cracks, those are always the signs present before it happens. Now, what you can't say for certainty is that every time those things exist, that it ends up that way, because sometimes it doesn't. Things can change. But every time there is a collapse, you can look backward, you can see all of these signs are present, and it is a major, major issue. Now, one of the other things that goes along with this is, what are your leaders doing about it? What are you saying? So we've talked specifically a lot about the conditions and the situations for the Ukrainian men in the Kursk area in particular. And as it so turns out, I believe it was yesterday, Zelensky made some commentary about the Kursk direction, but his focus was on something different.
Деталі щодо Курщини, бої за участю північно-корейських військових. У них багато втрат, дуже. І ми бачимо, що російські військові та північно-корейські наглядачі взагалі не зацікавлені у виживанні цих корейців. Все у них робиться так, щоб для нас було неможливо захопити корейців в полон. Їх свої ж добивають, є такі факти, і в штурми росіяни їх посилають так, щоб у них було мінімум захисту. Сьогодні були повідомлення щодо кількох солдатів з Північної Кореї. Нашим воїнам вдалося взяти їх в полон, але вони були дуже важко поранені, і їх не вдалося реанімувати. Це один із проявів того божевілля, на яке здатні диктатури. Корейський народ не має втрачати своїх людей в боях в Європі.
Now, what do you think the Ukrainian fighters sitting in those trenches that we were talking about, or fighting there in the Kursk area, is thinking about when they hear their leader doesn't talk about them, doesn't talk about the things that they're going through and doing something about it? Because sometimes he does say, I applaud the efforts of this battalion or that brigade. No one cares about that. What they care is, what are you doing about it? But when they see even your words are talking about the North Koreans, I mean, come on, man. At some point, let's just call this what it is. North Koreans are a distraction. It's a minor issue down here, if it's happening at all. There's still unclear, different reports on both sides whether they actually are North Koreans or just Asians that are already in the Russian armed forces. It's unclear on that. The Ukraine side is absolutely claiming it is. But so what? Let's say that the Ukraine side in this particular case is completely telling the truth, and there are 10,000 North Korean soldiers there. Who cares? It's obviously a novelty kind of a deal. It's not like the Russian army is shrinking and they're needing lots of troops from other countries to come in, and they're just barely holding on to the line. I'm about to show you how that is that radically untrue, and you'll see that in just a second. But let's take a look at what it is. First of all, then the Zelensky blames the leader for Korea for how could you send your people into these kind of conditions and have these terrible casualties and losses when your troops see graphically how you don't care about them and how you're unconcerned about them. Because as I told you, the battle, even forget the war for the moment, the battle for the Kursk is lost. It's only a matter of time. It's literally only a matter of time. There's no way that the Ukraine side can hang on. Those men know it, and they're complaining about it, and it's reaching even the Washington Post and New York Times. So if you, the leader of the country, are so disconnected from the needs of your men and oblivious in an attempt, I can only imagine, and I'm just guessing here, that Zelensky makes that kind of video for an American press so that we can hear it and somehow think something good for Ukraine. It's hard for me to imagine what his motivation is, but he's saying it in his own language, ergo, it will get down to the troops on the level there in the fighting for his side. What does he think they're going to think about that when all you're talking about is how bad the leader of this other country is in the Kursk salient, whose troops are suffering, and you're doing nothing about your own troops there? So that all it's going to do, if his intention, Zelensky, was to raise motivation or morale or to highlight the need to keep supporting them something, he's unwittingly, I think, eroding even further the fighting spirit of his own men. And listen, that brings us to another point, which I think is so important to understand here. And it's something we talked about a little bit, but I wanted to take an opportunity today to really drive home how important this fact is. There are too often we focus on this battle or this outcome or this city, et cetera, like that's going to make or break the war. Somehow, if the Ukraine side can defend against Kursk, for example, if they can hold out there, then somehow that can change the tide of the war. Or in Kurakova, for example, that reservoir that's near Kursk, if they can hold out there, then fill in the blank, something positive. None of that's true. This is a war of attrition. Several months ago, we actually did a whole show on the Royal United Services Institute article by Alex Vershinin, a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel who published this thing called The Attritional Art of War, Lessons from the Russian War on Ukraine. And so that was in March. That was earlier this year that was published. And everything in this thing has just borne out as true as can possibly be. And one of the things that he writes in here, which I think is most important and relevant to this conversation here, is he writes, attritional wars require their own art of war and are fought with force-centric approach, unlike wars of maneuver, which are terrain-focused. They are rooted in massive industrial capacity to enable the replacement of losses, geographical depth to absorb a series of defeats, and technological conditions that prevent rapid ground movement. In attritional wars, military operations are shaped by a state's ability to replace losses and generate new formations, not tactical and operational maneuvers. The side that accepts the attritional nature of war and focuses on destroying the enemy forces rather than gaining terrain is most likely to win. Now, when you take that template, that lens, and you look at this war, and you look at even just the last few months of it, Russia is absolutely following that path. Their industrial capacity is off the charts. The Ukrainian industrial capacity is limping and it's on life support. One of the reasons why you see every few days or a week or two, Russia launches this large missile or drone barrage throughout the Ukrainian countryside, hitting energy systems. Because if you don't have electricity, if you don't have heat, then you can't generate capacity. If there's a factory that's identified, the factory gets burned down. Those are happening all. And it has been for the better part of 2 years now. It's been a methodical, just relentless drive, which, and to their credit, the Ukrainian side has been amazing in how they still find ways around some of that with generated power or diversion of other resources, et cetera. But the best they can do is just inch along, and they cannot keep up and never will even match the Russian side, much less ever outdo it, even with all of what's going on in the West. So on that capacity, Russia is off the charts doing better. They also are focused on manpower. And to reinforce on that side of the equation, my comment that it's men, not machines, not money. You have to have machines and money, but without the men, it's not going to work. And that's really what I want to show you. That's part of the equation that almost nobody in the West pays attention to, because if anything even sounds like it's positive for the Russian side, we just ignore it. Well, the danger in doing that, one of many, is if you don't know what your opponent is doing, then you don't know why, I argue so vehemently, that the war is already decided. It's already over. It's just a matter of how big the final tally in the bill is going to be for the Ukraine side. Now, I've just shown you a number of videos and newspaper reports about the destroying and the crumbling morale, about the physical movements on the battlefield to the west. Everything's going against them. But let's look at the other half of that. So there, another friend of our show, Alex from HistoryLegends, we've had on several times, hopefully have him on soon as well, has published a piece. And by the way, the link to this full episode, which I strongly recommend you watching, is in the description of this video here. It was just published this morning. It's brand new. And in this, he lays out how the Russians are able to recruit, not force mobilize people. And listen, I'm going to show you just a very small portion of the beginning of his video here. And he's going to explain some of the more important things. And then I'll explain on the backside how important they really are.
My friends, in a war of attrition like the one we can see in Ukraine, manpower is key. And it seems Russia is getting the upper hand. But this time without having to resort to mobilization. All the new soldiers are volunteers. Here from the Defense Post. Russian army's tempting offers paying off as recruitment surges sixfold. Or here, Putin says Russia recruited more than 430,000 to army this year. Russia's recruiting 25,000 to 30,000 new soldiers a month.
For the Emperor!
Hurrah! How exactly did Russia manage to grow such a massive army within only a year? How did Russia convince so many men to join the war? The strategy was simple. Get rich while serving your country. All across Russia, from rural areas to busy city centers, there are these massive billboards displaying army recruitment ads lined up one after the other. Even in the most remote areas of Siberia, you will find such leaflets with the bonus payments you will receive as a soldier. And that's without even taking into account the numerous recruitment commercials that were posted online.
That actually had some dramatic music behind it, which we have to cut because otherwise they have copyright issues, whatever. But you can imagine that those commercials are showing in Russia. And listen, one of the things that Alex points out in the other parts of that video that we want you to recommend you go and watch it, he points out how the financial resources of the Russian state are what's allowing this. There's a combination of several things going on here. Is that they are Russia historically, as I've pointed out several times, they were invaded from the West by Napoleon 2 centuries ago. They were last century, they were invaded from the West by Adolf Hitler. And so now then you have here NATO coming right up to the border. And as we brag all the time, 50 nations are supporting Ukraine against Russia in a war right up to the border, and now even across the border into Russia. So that automatically gets to the cultural identity, the cultural fear that the Russians have of the West. And so that's why I so want to, just pound on the desk to show people that if you think the Russians are going to get tired of this war, then you've been listening to Western propaganda that says, oh, they'll just get tired of it, just like the U.S. did in Vietnam. We're not talking about something on the other side of the world. We're talking about something that is now in your country and across the borders elsewhere. So it is an existential issue inside their country. They will never stop fighting. So just the patriotism alone is a big motivation for them to see this is a war we can't lose. So that's important. But then you're talking about the financial issue as well. And the amounts of money that they're being offering here. And Alex, he shows this map of Russia and where the recruits are coming from. And then he overlays that with another map that shows the economic conditions of the people of Russia. And some of the more poor areas are the ones that provide the most soldiers. Not surprisingly, because when they can, the Russian side can offer for a year contract the equivalent of 6 times the average living wage in some of these areas, 6 times. And then a lot of the benefits that go with it that are way beyond what even the monetary situations are. They're doing things like taking care of their family members back home. They're giving them declined or reduced costs for public transportation, for example. They're giving them access to medical care, et cetera, much like the U.S. Army does for dependents back home. They're doing all of these things. The dependents back home have places to go. And that's actually a Ukraine recruitment ad there. Oddly enough, that's what they're trying to appeal to, which obviously is not working. But the Russian side, though, they continue to take care of their people. They take care of the troops on the front line. They give them training before they go. They give them, in many cases, 6 months of training, and then they ease them into easier parts of the front first. They replace them when troops get worn out on the front. They replace them and give them rest and recuperation. They do all the things that a modern army does that succeeds. And one of the for some of the troops in there, they said the equivalent, if you compare apples to apples in the cost of living, et cetera, a U.S. Army trooper, a private, for example, can get, I think it's like $25,000 base salary plus all the benefits in here. Well, for the Russia, the equivalent buying power is just like, say, give a guy $190,000 if you want to compare that to what you would make in the U.S. So just imagine if you and an American or a Western European were said, hey, how about $190,000 for a young recruit to come in and we'll even take care of your family. And, there's money to be paid if anything happens to you, et cetera. On top of some motivation and morale and patriotism issues, that's a pretty big incentive. Ergo, even with all of the losses the Russian side has been suffering, and by the accounts of Media Zona, that number is about 85,000 dead Russians as of the 17th of December, which is a monstrous total. It's hard to fathom. Just as a comparison, the U.S. lost, I think, is 54,000 in the entire Vietnam War. And these guys have doubled that basically, or come close to it. And then you add on all the wounded on top of that. There's always this caricature that the West likes to say it's 700,000. That's not, you can't, there's no evidence that that's true. But just stick with the truth, because the truth is enormous. That is a huge loss. And yet they keep getting more and more troops to sign up, to the tune of 430,000. So far, the Russians got in calendar year 2024, 430,000 troops had joined the army. By comparison, the U.S. Army is nearly that figure. It's like 452,000. Can you imagine that? The entire size of all active duty forces of the U.S. Army are about equivalent to what Russia got this year. That's why that the total number of active forces in Russia now is going to be somewhere around 1.5 million as of the 31st of this month. 1.5 million. So while the Ukraine side is being ground to dust, while its territory is being shrunk, while its cities are being destroyed, the Russian side is growing its armed forces. It's getting bigger and stronger. Now, one of the objectives that we foolishly set for ourselves at the beginning, rather arrogantly, is that we were supporting this war because it would weaken Russia. Do they sound weakened? We tried to destroy their economy. And instead, their economy is doing better than most in the Western Europe. It does have some weak signs. There's lots of inflation. They do have some problems, which Putin admitted a couple of days ago. But don't get any heart for that, because believe me, historically, the Russians can suffer a lot. And as a nation, they have not suffered at all, because while the Ukraine side here is their own country is burning, and many of these people, they can't even use some of the money that their family, because number one, they're not taken care of. Number two, because so much power is outage, they have a terrible quality of life, even in the other parts of the country that are not directly in the front lines. It's the opposite in Russia. They're continuing to go on in really good situation for the most part. There are obviously plenty of poor areas in Russia as well, but by and large, the Russian side, the economy is doing well. It's doing adequate and strong in some regards here, but it will be able to go on for a long time. If you need any more evidence, just look at the fact that they have this cash to give to all these guys. And this is not just promises, they deliver on it. Otherwise, they wouldn't continue to get recruit when these guys go back. So that shows you that everywhere you want to look, that Alex Vershinin article from Royal United Services Institute is spot on and is playing out exactly like he said. It is a war of attrition. And I've often lamented on here in uncertainty and really not clear on why the Russians have never chosen to bring a hammer down. And apparently they've got, several 100,000 troops in reserve that they have not even used yet, as to why they didn't, push hard on some of these weakened lines to bring this thing to an end closer. They got their own reasons. I don't know. But what I can tell you is, and observe on a daily basis, is that they can just keep going as they are without any change, without any big arrow movements. And eventually the death toll will finally get to a point that the army literally just ceases to exist, because, as Alex Vershinin pointed out there, the focus is on the destruction of the enemy armed forces, not so much on territory. If you do the former, knock out their armed forces, then the territory will take care of itself. Then they won't even have to worry about it. They don't have to physically conquer everything. They just have to finally break the Ukrainian armed forces. And once that happens, then there's nothing left to defend, and they can take whatever they want land-wise. That's where we're going. And that probably is one of the reasons why back on June 14th, Vladimir Putin said, hey, listen, we're willing to have a negotiated settlement, but you need to understand, here is our minimum level. And in this clip that we're going to show you here, it has been reinforced just a couple of weeks ago by Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, is that they said this is still the situation here. You had Sergei Lavrov a couple of days ago. We've shown you, I think, earlier this week, some of the comments he made. Vladimir Putin himself has reiterated portions of this, but this is apparently the no-kidding start point for any negotiations.
Наши соединения действительно стояли у Киева. И у военных ведомств, у силового блока были разные предложения по вариантам наших возможных дальнейших действий. Но никакого политического решения о штурме 3-миллионного города, кто бы чего ни говорил, ни домысливал, не было. По сути, это было не что иное, как операция по принуждению украинского режима к миру. Войска там были для того, чтобы подтолкнуть украинскую сторону к переговорам, попытаться найти приемлемые решения. То, что предлагают устроители встречи в Швейцарии, лишь еще одна уловка, чтобы отвлечь всеобщее внимание, поменять местами причину и следствие украинского кризиса, пустить дискуссию по ложному следу. Наши соединения действительно
and to
стояли.
show you what that looks like on the map here, when he says those 4 oblasts, these are the areas. A lot of that's up here, and those 4. I don't have the boundaries here, but they encompass this area here. But these gray areas right here are what is not conquered. This is the political boundaries of those 4 oblasts that have not yet been conquered by Russia. So he's saying that you have to give us all of these willingly for there to be an end negotiations. Otherwise, he'll just continue on the path that he's been with his with his military operations, his focus on the destruction of the enemy armed forces until he just takes the areas. And he can do that. He doesn't have to negotiate with Donald Trump coming in there. He wants to. He's willing to. He said a couple of days ago, he reiterated, we're willing to talk. We're willing to use Slovakia as a neutral arbiter. We can have the negotiations there. We can meet in the Middle East. He is willing to have those kind of discussions. But That is his minimum number right there, because that's what achieves his political outcomes, which is a non-aligned, non-nuclear Ukraine that will never join NATO and provides him security on his western flank. That's what Putin has set, and he has the capacity to ensure that. He can get that with no negotiations. Donald Trump cannot do anything that Putin asks, and Putin will still get all the things he asked for, or he'll keep going if it doesn't get the declaration of a non-NATO. That would be the one part that he couldn't unilaterally get, but he can conquer on the ground. And that is why, the incoming administration needs to be very sober-minded on where the leverages are. And there are a few on our side, but there are a whole bunch more on the other side. And we need to be clear-minded on what's legitimate and what's reasonably capable here. This war can be brought to an end, but it's going to be painful for the West. Nowhere near as good as it would have been in April of 2022. Matter of fact, part of the deals that was reported at the time was that Russia would eventually withdraw its troops from all of these territories, and as long as they had autonomy or something to that effect, under the umbrella of being in Kiev. That's now way gone. That's permanently gone. It'll never come back. None of these 4 territories in Crimea will ever come back into Ukraine control. The question is, will we make a deal to solidify it on those lines that I just showed you, or will the Russians just keep going if we're not willing to make that kind of a deal? That's where we are. That's where this whole war is coming down to right now. That's what the reality of it is. No matter what anybody in the West wants to tell you, no matter what Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, DW, a lot of these places, BBC, they all want to tell you one thing. It's an aspiration of what they wish would be true. We're showing you what is true, the pros and the cons for each side, the negotiating leverage that does and doesn't exist for each side. And this is the truth, folks. You have it right here. We'll see how this eventually plays out, but there's almost no chance it plays out anything less than that map that I just showed you with the gray thatched areas there for those 4 oblasts. In the last thing I want to leave you with here is more of an embarrassment for my country, and that is U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, who, and this isn't anything he said here recently, but it's something that he continues to say over and over in many venues, in that while we have been focused, even in this episode here, on this horrible consequences and the price being levied on the Ukrainian men, on the Ukrainian nation, on their cities, and how this is eventually going to shake out. And our focus has always been on limiting the damage to the Ukraine side, ending the killing on the Ukraine side. That's what we're focused on. That's what any normal human being would be focused on. Instead, and this is unfortunately not the only guy like this, there's several others. Here's what Lindsey Graham is focused on.
Ukraine is still standing. This war is about money. People don't talk much about it. But you know the richest country in all of Europe for rare earth minerals is Ukraine. $2 to $7 trillion worth of minerals that are rare earth minerals, very relevant to the 21st century. Ukraine's ready to do a deal with us, not the Russians. So it's in our interest to make sure that Russia doesn't take over the place. It's the breadbasket of really the developing world. 50% of all the food going to Africa comes out of Ukraine. We can make money and have an economic relationship with Ukraine that'd be very beneficial to us with peace. So Donald Trump's going to do a deal to get our money back, to enrich ourselves with rare earth minerals, a good deal for Ukraine and us, and he's going to bring peace.
Donald Trump is going to get our money back. It's a good deal for Ukraine, so he says, as though he's talking about some business transaction, utterly oblivious to the carnage on the ground that his support for this war has wrought. And you wonder why the Ukrainian troops are bloodied and demoralized. And Graham has gone even further in that in some other sound bites we played over the course of this year. You may believe it was earlier in the spring when he went to Kiev and he was hawking F-16s and a bunch of other stuff. But on one particular visit, he was actually compelling and putting pressure on Zelensky to lower the age to 18 for the recruitment, for the mobilization, encouraging them to go fight. Y'all get out there on the front lines and fight. oblivious to this cost or unconcerned about it. Maybe he's not oblivious. Maybe he just doesn't care. He's not the only one like this. There's a lot of people in many European countries and certainly in the United States that they're just so blind in their hatred of Russia that they perceive that this is harmful. This war has been harmful to Russia and are oblivious to the fact that while Russia was harmed in the beginning, now then they have recovered and accelerated beyond that. And so now then they're stronger than they were, and they're a much more formidable force, that because of all this stuff, we're weaker than we were. This is something that doesn't get enough conversation. And I may actually do a specific show on this in the new year, that our forces are weaker than they were. And the reason for that is, number one, because we are very, very slow on the doctrinal side to adjust our way of fighting based on the observed realities of modern warfare, modern land warfare. We've made a handful of changes, and we need to make about this many. So that by itself is a problem. We can't recruit very many. We're having serious problems in every armed forces branch except for the Marines. And possibly most importantly of all, because we have let so many of our weapon systems be used by the Ukrainians, we have made a virtual laboratory for our enemies or our potential enemies to be able to figure out how to defeat our missile systems, how to defeat our air defense systems, how to defeat our ground platforms, where they're strong, where they're weak, etc. So in the event that we ever have to defend ourselves and actually fight a war against, a peer enemy, that there's all this information out there that they'll already know about us that we won't know about them, not directly, because we haven't fought against them. So we're actually weaker than we were because of the absurd and irrational and immoral focus on money. We're going to get a lot of money out of this. It's all about money. He said without any embarrassment at all. He wasn't even being coy about it. He was being straight up about it, not realizing that he could literally be signing our own death warrants of some of our troops should we ever get into a war. Then that is something that will have to be reconciled later on. And of course, I hope that it never happens. I hope it remains a possibility, a theoretical possibility that doesn't actually get manifested. But right now, I can tell you for certain that our national security is weaker today because of this war that we've done, because of what the Biden administration has done, because of what the likes of Republicans, Lindsey Graham, and you certainly got the chief of the Senate leader, Mitch McConnell, is just as guilty about this, and so many others on both parties. They don't really care. They care about the money, apparently. And we'll see what happens with this. Bottom line is we certainly hope that this war is brought to a quick. We hope that President Trump comes in and does what he said and just gets the best deal he can, and understand it's not going to be a great one. Just get it off the table, get the killing stopped, and let's move on to try and start recovering from all of these losses. That's what's on the table. That's what's possible. That's what we can do. And what we here at Daniel Davis Deep Dive do fervently pray happens, because ultimately and overridingly, I care so much more about the Ukrainian people, about their men on the front lines, and about their families back in the rear than apparently any of these guys do here who claim the otherwise. We'll see how it plays out. You can count on us to bring it to you as it happens and give you this kind of commentary on what's really happening, the no kidding bottom line. Thank you very much for joining us today. Do remember that we're on podcast now. I know you can't always watch the videos, but you can listen to us when you're heading to the store or driving across the country or whatever you're doing. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will find us waiting there for you. And we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.